Taking care of your own bike is a way to save money and a way to learn more about your bike and get to know your bike and, to sort of improve yourself as a cyclist so that you're able to troubleshoot problems. Tonight's class is going to go through some very basic procedures, so basic that you probably don't even need tools for them. So we're going to cover how to inflate your tires. We'll cover cleaning and lubricating your chain and your cables. And we will, in each section, cover tools and equipment that you might need. And thank you for those of you who are just rejoining the meeting. Hopefully we won't get disconnected again. So you want to take good care of your bike. It's a machine, it does hard work, it needs maintenance, it needs occasional parts replacement or things that wear out. Things that wear out can include grips, brake pads, tires certainly, your chain, the gears, very occasionally your cables. Really, if you maintain and repair, keep your bike in good condition, those consumables, parts that wear out, will not last forever, but your bike will, assuming you don't crash it or something like that. Bikes will last a long time. They do hard work, but with some care, they last a long time. So let's go to our presentation again. So first you want to keep your tires inflated. Tires lose air naturally. Over the course of 1 week, a tire can lose about half of its air, depending on the quality of the tube and the tire that you have. And of course, occasionally you will want to replace your tires. We're not going to go through that tonight, but just routine maintenance, keep those tires inflated. So for that, you're going to need a floor pump at home. I also carry a frame pump with me if I'm away from home for like a vacation or something with my bike. That way I can keep my tire inflated. Bike shops often have a complimentary pump outside the door or an air hose. So it's a good idea just to keep a good quality floor pump made mostly of metal, not plastic, at home. And it's a good idea to have one with a gauge. So Trex keeps this one around. It's has a nice big gauge on the bottom, and that gauge goes all the way up to 160 pounds. So it will inflate and read pressure for practically any type of bike tire. Now, keep in mind, there are actually three types of valves, but the two most common are Presta, which is a metal valve, has a little plastic cap on the top, and take that cap off, you have to unscrew this little piece right here. Just unscrew it and then tap down on it, and you'll hear a little bit of air escape. And most pumps have a type of head on the hose that will allow you to inflate both of these types of valves. Sometimes the head is just one opening that will fit both. Other times it's two openings. And as you can see, the Presta valve is skinnier than the common Schrader valve. And Schrader is the same type of valve that cars and all motorized vehicles use. And all you have to do is take this plastic cap off. You press the valve head down on the valve, and then usually it has a locking mechanism like this lever here. And the locking mechanism works differently depending on the pump you have. Some locking mechanisms flip up, others flip down, but you do want to lock it on the valve to make an airtight seal. Now, if your pump doesn't have a gauge, bike shops and places like Amazon and bike retailers like REI, even I think Trek, Jensen USA will sell gauges so that you can check what your air pressure is. But the gauge has to go up pretty high because a gauge for a motor vehicle is not going to be high enough for most bike air pressures. Now, if your pump is really only set up, like maybe it's an older pump or less expensive, and it's only set up for the Schrader valves, this one here, you can buy what's called a Presta adapter if your bike has Presta valves. And what you do is when you take the little cap off the Presta valve and you open up the valve by unscrewing it, you screw this little adapter down on it and it makes the width of the valve the same width as the Schrader so that your pump will fit on it. So you can see a little more close up here. The valve, there's a little pin inside the Schrader valve, and if you push on that, air will come out. Whereas this, you have to unscrew this part right here. It doesn't come out without a special tool. You just unscrew it with your fingers. And if you push down on it, it will let out a little bit of air. Even if you forget to close it at the end of pumping this up, it won't let air out normally on its own because it's held closed by the air pressure itself. So you want to make sure that you inflate your tires to the recommended inflation. And usually that's written somewhere on the side of the tire. And it will say inflate to or maximum pressure, or here it says PSI, which stands for pounds per square inch. There will oftentimes be a lot of print with a lot of numbers because European countries and the rest of the world uses metric, whereas we still use English pounds for pressure. So keep it inflated within that range. The lower side of the range, let's say you have a mountain bike and it says minimum pressure 35, maximum pressure 65. So the maximum pressure, if you have it up to that pressure, it will give you a faster ride, but you're going to feel road bumps and road vibration more. If you go to the lower end of that pressure, you'll feel the road bumps less, but you'll work slightly harder because more of the tires contacting the surface or the pavement. So what you want to do is put your pump head on, and here my pump is down on the Presta valve. I believe my pump flips up. I forget whether it flips up or flips down, even though I've been using that same pump for like 30 years now. But you put it on the valve, you lock it in place. And as I said, there's a difference between the higher and the lower pressure range of your tire. Then you use your pump to inflate the tire. And when you're done, you want to take that Presta adapter off, close the valve by screwing it back in. It's a good idea to put the dust caps back on because if you were riding in wet, salty, sandy, dusty, dirty conditions, those caps actually keep the valves cleaner and operating better when you need to put air in the tire. It's a good idea to check your tires before every ride by just giving them a good hard squeeze. I squeeze them with my 4 fingers and thumb on each side, nice hard squeeze. And even when they're inflated to their minimum pressure, they should feel pretty hard. They should feel almost rock hard. And that's how you sort of know when you have the right pressure. Now, if you get a flat tire on the road, and we're not going to go through how to change that, that's a different class. Your frame pump might not have a gauge on it. Many of them don't. So you do have to inflate those tires till you feel that they're rock hard when you give them a nice hard squeeze. And so do that, and that's, inflating your tires is going to make your riding easier. If you feel like your bike is getting sluggish, maybe you haven't inflated the tires for 2 or 3 weeks, feel like you're working too hard, pump them up and it'll feel like a different bike. It will actually make you faster, more efficient. Speaking of faster and more efficient, here's another thing that you can do that's actually pretty easy that will make your bike feel different. I think ideally you want to clean and lube your chain once a week if you are riding your bike every single day. If you're riding your bike less often, I would maybe clean and lube the chain every 7 to 10 rides. If you are riding in wet, salty, sandy, dirty conditions, like for mountain biking, winter cycling in the snow, you want to do it more often. We'll get into that hopefully during this part of the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about your chain. Now, your chain's one of the hardest working parts of your bike. It has hundreds of parts in it. One link consists of an outer plate, an inner plate, 3 pins, and 3 rollers. And the rollers are these little bushings inside. And one chain probably has 2-3 dozen of these links on it. So the part that does the work is actually the roller and the pin right here. You don't need to get lube in here because there's nothing going on there mechanically in terms of stuff moving around. It's where the chain pivots right at these pins, and that's where you need to get lube. So I use there's little machines, handheld machines that you can buy. They're not electrical or anything, but you put chain solvent or chain cleaner in the bottom of that little machine. You attach the machine to the chain or the derailleur, and you rotate the chain as it's on its gears. You rotate the pedals backwards generally. And it has a series of brushes and other little mechanisms that one pump cleaner and solvent onto the chain. And then they kind of like wipe and scrub crud that collects on the chain off. And I've used those before, but really I prefer a much simpler system of some sort of a cleaner, solvent, and a rag. So one cleaner solvent you can use is called Simple Green. You can get them at many grocery stores, maybe drugstores, certainly Home Depot and Lowe's carry Simple Green. It's a biodegradable degreaser. There's also orange or citrus-based degreasers that also work very well. And I just use a spray bottle. I don't get aerosols with this stuff. Second thing you're going to need is some sort of a rag. I save some kinds of cotton clothing, old socks, underwear, t-shirts. Those are pretty absorbent and they're good for cleaning chains. And then finally, you're going to need chain lube, and we'll talk about different types of lube here. This is kind of one of the chain cleaner mechanisms I was talking about, where you would pour your cleaner. You'd open up this lid on the top and pour your cleaner in here, and you can see there's some brushes. There's a little plastic, I don't know what you call it. It's a series of baffles that the chain has to run through that attempts to get crud off of there. Because oil is kind of a sticky substance, it collects dust and dirt that's on the street and road that your tires kick up. And your chain just loves to collect that stuff. So you want to clean that every time or every other time you lube your chain, because that road grit is actually kind of abrasive and it wears your chain out faster. But I just use a rag. So a lot of chains have what are called a connecting link. Certainly BMX bikes have this. Shimano and Campagnolo branded chains don't use this type of link, but this is an easy marker to identify so that you know where you started your cleaning project and where you started putting lube on. So if you don't have you know, an obvious link like this, what you can do is maybe put a little fingernail, clean one link, and then put a little fingernail polish or chalk or something identifiable on it that will allow the chain to run through the gears and everything without binding it. Like I wouldn't put a zip tie on it because the zip tie won't go through your derailleur. And then I work backwards from that length and I pedal backwards as I clean each section of the chain, or I lube each section of the chain until this link comes around, and then I know I'm done and I've completed one circuit of the chain. So what I do is I put my rag behind the chain and I'm working on the bottom half of the chain, between the bottom of the crankset and the bottom of the derailleur. And I put my rag back there so the spray is not spraying all over the place, and it actually collects on the rag, which helps the rag also clean the chain better. And then I rub the rag along that section of chain between the derailleur and the crankset. Once I've got it clean, I rotate the crankset so this part goes up here. I spray the next section down, and then I clean it with a cleaner section of the rag than what was just touching the first section that I cleaned. I hope this is clear. Once I've gone clear around the chain, I let it wait a while. So this might be like an evening project before you ride in the morning or something like that, or a rainy day project when you don't plan to ride. But I don't want to put chain lube right on, you know, a chain that still has wet degreaser or wet solvent, because the solvent works against the lube. So you want that stuff to evaporate and dry off. By the way, I got a couple products here from the Trek store. This is a degreaser. It's good for cleaning the dirty chain and other parts of your drivetrain, like the chain rings and the derailleur pulleys. They get really dirty. And you can see it's a pump bottle, so you can spray a rag down with this stuff. And then Trek is also selling, this seems like a wet lube and oil-based lube. So there are different types of chain lube. They're wet oil-based lubes, which a lot of like road cyclists, people staying on pavement, like to use. And wet lubes are probably better for winter wet and salty riding. Then there are dry lubes, which are more like silicone-based. Mountain bikers who are often riding in dirty, dusty conditions like the silicone-based because they tend to attract less dirt. There are also wax-based lubes like, oh gosh, I used to use one at one time, and I forgot the brand name, White Lightning. Don't confuse that with the homemade Kentucky alcohol White Lightning. That's actually a solvent. If you don't have a bike shop near you, a couple of different types of lube that are commonly available at hardware stores or Home Depot are 3-in-1 oil or Tri-Flow. Tri-Flow is often sold in bike shops as well. Those are pretty lightweight oil-based lubes. 3-in-1 oil, actually, no, it's Tri-Flow that actually smells pretty nice. Getting back to lubing the chain, what you want to do is put one drop on each of these rollers, starting at your connecting length or the length that you marked. Just one drop. So if you get too much lube on, that eventually turns your chain into a big greasy dirty mess, because the more lube you get on there, the more dirt it attracts. And so you want to go easy on the lube. So lube more often, but use less lube when you do lube it. Just one drop on each of the rollers, the inside part here, right here where the arrow's at, kind of that piece right between the links, the outer and the inner plate, is where you want to drop that lube. And I go easy. I don't roll the chain while I'm dribbling lube on it. It's just like one drop at a time. It takes you about 2 minutes to go through the whole chain that way. Not very long. And as I mentioned, you do want to lube more often if you're riding in wet, winter, salty conditions. Just to give you an example, I have ruined a couple of fairly new chains by neglecting this during the winter time. I'd ride in the snow and the slush, park my bike, go home, get home, and park my bike, have a beer or two, and you know, a week later, my chain was rusted solid after a couple of rides like that in salty conditions. So if you are riding in snow and ice and salt, please do be nice to your chain, because chains are not cheap. Well, they're not terribly expensive either, but you don't want to have to replace a chain. Oftentimes, if you have to replace a chain, you have to replace the cassette on the rear wheel with it. And that's where it starts to get a little bit spendy. And then, of course, if you're riding a lot in dust, sand, mud, dirt, mountain biking, unpaved rail trails, things like that, you'll want to clean and lube your chain more often. Okay, let's talk about your cables. Now, your cables operate your brakes and your gears, unless you have electronic shifting, which we won't cover this evening, and that's still available really only on the most expensive bikes out there. So what are you going to need? You're going to need some chain lube or some grease, and you can use almost any type of grease. You can go to Home Depot and get their grease, or Harbor Freight and get their grease. Or there's grease that's specially formulated for bike parts, but grease is kind of grease for these kinds of applications. And what grease or lube does is allows things to slide back and forth more smoothly, especially cables that are inside the hose or the housing that they run through between your brakes or between your shifters and the derailleurs and the brakes on the bike. So let's talk a little about your cable anatomy on the bike. So you have this kind of like hose or tubing called housing, and that runs between the levers, either the brake or the gear levers, and your brakes or the derailleurs. And what the housing does is it allows the cable to turn curves and corners on the bike between the levers and where it needs to go. The cables generally don't need housing where it's running in a straight line. And then you have the cable itself, which does the work, and that's what runs inside this housing. So it's this part that runs inside the housing that needs the lube, because that's where the friction is going to be, where it runs back and forth. Another example, see a couple of runs of housing. This is the front of the bike. So what I do, and you don't need to do this terribly often, maybe once a year, twice a year, is for the gears, I shift the chain to the biggest cog and I leave it there. And then on the shifters, I use the buttons on the shifters to release pressure from the cable so the cable is slack. Let's see, the cable slack here, the chain is on the biggest gear. And on most bikes, you'll have these little stops on the frame where the housing runs into a stop and then the cable can run for a straight line. And on most modern bikes, those stops have a little slot in them where you can pull the housing out and the cable slides or can be run out of that slot. So you can see here, I pulled the housing out and now the cable is free and it's still attached here at the derailleur. And now I can slide that housing forward to expose the part of the cable that runs inside of here. And that's where I'm going to put my chain lube or a little bit of grease. You don't need to go crazy with the lube or the grease, just a little bit. And sometimes if I can, I use gravity to try to dribble a little bit of chain lube inside of here. Before I do that, I might try running a rag over the part of the cable that runs in here and just to kind of clean any residue off. And then I put the housing back into its stop, slide that cable through the slot, and then I put the shifter back to the point where it had shifted the chain to. Now there's one other little bit of maintenance you can do, and you might need to do this if you have a brand new bike or if you just replaced a cable. So when the cables and the housing are new, the housing compresses a little bit as you use it, and the cable stretches a little bit, up to 1/8 of an inch. And for modern shifters, that throws your shifting off, especially if you're shifting. Let's go back to one of the pictures here. If you're shifting from the small cogs to the bigger cog, usually your shifters pull the cable and there's a precise tension that it has to have to pull just enough cable to shift it to the next bigger cog. It tends not to be a problem as you're shifting back to these smaller cogs because there you're letting cable out. It's when you're pulling on the cable to shift it here that cable stretch becomes a problem. So there's these devices on your brake levers and your derailleurs, and sometimes your shift levers if you have mountain bike shift levers, called adjusting barrels. The back side of your derailleur has a little gizmo like this, and what it is, it's a bolt that's hollow, and your cable goes through that bolt and comes out here and then attaches to the anchor point on the derailleur. Your brake has the same thing. And this little spring here actually keeps this hollow bolt called the adjusting barrel in its position that you set it, so it doesn't unscrew itself as you are riding and using it. To take up slack out of the cable, if it's stretched in a little bit after you replaced the cable or when you bought a new bike, you unscrew this, and what it does is it increases the distance between here and here. And as you unscrew it, and this keeps coming out, it's going to take the slack out of your cable. Now, if you were doing this, a little goes a long ways. If you were shifting the larger cogs and it hesitates, it rattles, it goes on the gear, but it's still rattling a little bit, you want to unscrew or turn counterclockwise that adjusting barrel. half a turn at a time. If you have modern 10 or 11 speed gears on the back, maybe a quarter of a turn at a time, because a little goes a long ways with that close, tight spacing of, say, an 11 or 12 speed. Then you test it. Shift the chain to the smallest cog, pedal the chain. You can do this while riding. Use your shifter one cog at a time. And when you have it adjusted correctly, the chain should shift precisely from a smaller cog to the next bigger cog. It should not jump 2 cogs unless you shifted 2 gears. So you want to shift 1 gear at a time. Now, bike shops will often do this because it's a quick and easy adjustment. 30 seconds, you do have to test it. Bike shops will often do these adjustments for you if you bought the bike at their shop. They'll do it for free as part of your purchase package. But it's an easy thing if you don't want to run to a shop. It's an easy thing to do on your own. A couple of more places where you'll find adjusting barrels. If you have mountain bike or hybrid brake levers like this, the adjusting barrel is at the end of the lever where the housing comes out as well as the cable. A lot of road bike brakes also have their adjusting barrel right here at the top of the brake where the cable goes into the brake, and this is the anchor point for the cable. Some road bikes, because road bike shifters often don't have an adjusting barrel attached to the brake lever shifter. They might have an adjusting barrel on the frame where the cable comes out of the housing, or they might have what's called an inline adjusting barrel, which is a piece in the housing that you can unscrew. And it's very noticeable. The housing gets interrupted by this kind of tubular object that's inserted into the housing. I don't have a good picture of it though. So you want to check your brakes periodically because the cables for the brakes also stretch a little bit, and then brake pads wear out. And as you remove material from the brake pad, you have to pull the brake lever farther and farther to get the brake to engage the wheel. So the rule that you want to use is when you squeeze the brake lever and the brake pads engage the wheel, whether it's a disc brake or a rim brake, you should be able to fit your thumb between the brake lever and the handlebar. If you have to pull your brake lever so far that you can't fit your thumb in there, then you need to tension the cable, tighten the cable up. It's the same with the derailleur, except there you don't need to be so precise. You can unscrew that adjusting barrel, whether it's on the brake lever or on the brake itself, until you get the right amount of tension. Now keep in mind, you don't have an unlimited amount of adjusting barrel. You may have a ½ inch that you can unscrew. So if that adjusting barrel is already screwed out quite a ways, you're probably going to need to do a cable adjustment where the cable anchors to either the brake or the derailleur. And that's where it gets involving tools, and maybe you need to take it to a bike shop for that. If you are adjusting your brake cable, most of the brakes have the adjusting barrel, which is this part, and then a lock nut. So you unscrew this part here, you get your adjustment right, and then you screw the lock nut against the body on the brake lever, or in this case, the body of the brake, and that keeps your adjustment in place so that it doesn't screw itself back in while you're using the brakes. And that is it for our very basic bike maintenance class tonight. It is 7:15. We've been going for about 45 minutes with a technical interruption. So I'm going to open it up to questions. And I'm going to let people unmute themselves. Oops, I already did. So you can ask a question in chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question verbally. So Katie asks, this is a good question. Can you ride immediately after lubing the chain, or should you let that dry too? Well, you could ride immediately after lubing, but you're probably going to get a little bit of splatter, especially on the rims and maybe other parts of the bike. I usually like to let the lube set in, dry a little bit, but that's not, not everybody has time to do that. So I try to lube it the night before that I'm going to go for a ride, or if I'm using that bike the next morning. This is also why I said go easy on the application of the lube, because if you use a lot of lube and then you go for a ride immediately, your bike is going to become an unholy mess. This is also why I like these little drip bottles, is they let me control how much I'm putting on. Whereas there are some lubes out there that are aerosols, and once you press the button on an aerosol, it lets out however much it wants to. And it generally lets out way more than you actually need.
Thank you.
Other questions? So Askelacour asks, can you mix lubes? For example, if my chain has oil-based lube, can I switch to silicone and vice versa? I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, but that's where I would definitely get the chain really, really clean with your solvent or your chain cleaner to eliminate most of the lube that was on there. And I'd probably be a little more patient with the cleaning and the drying process. If I really, really want to get a chain super, super clean, I use a tool to disconnect the links, and depending on the chain, type of chain you have, you might need either a chain press tool or a little pliers that releases those quick links that I showed in an earlier picture. And I'll throw my chain in an old jar or an old cake pan, and I'll put some mineral spirits in it, or you can use your degreaser, your orange solvent, and I'll let it sit and swish around and maybe overnight, and then I'll pull it out and dry it with a rag and let it evaporate. That gets it really, really pretty darn clean. Some people even use, you don't want to use your spouse's jewelry cleaner, but they vibrate. It's a high frequency vibration, and the dirt in the chain, which is inside the rollers and inside the pins, you're never going to get that stuff out just using a rag and degreaser. But some people really, really want their chain clean enough to eat off of, and they use that method. I would certainly ask your spouse's permission before you use the jewelry cleaner, the vibration-based jewelry cleaner, to do that, or just buy one separately. And then lube it the next day. Certainly just soaking your chain in a solvent overnight will get it really, really clean. I also, if I'm going to change lubes, clean the chain rings, and as much as I can, clean the cogs on the back of the bike. So like once a year, I'll really take my derailleur, my chain, and my chain rings apart and off the bike and soak them in some solvent to get them pretty darn clean. Okay, so Rob asks the question that everybody asks regardless of what type of class we're teaching, and that is, what's the update on when bike shops will replenish inventory? And we had a class last week at a different Trek shop. And unfortunately, it looks like this is going to be a problem for several months. They were saying due to production interruptions, transportation and shipping interruptions, bike shops probably won't see good stock again until next year. I think the thing to do is to just keep checking your shops as it gets less busy and colder, and we'll see what happens with the pandemic when it gets colder. But bike shops tend to slow down this time of year as it gets colder, and maybe they will have better stock during the fall and winter. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions. So Katie asks, speaking of getting colder, will winter biking classes be offered this fall? So we do offer a classroom type class that we will be offering via Zoom called Winter Cycling, which talks about safety on slick surfaces, how to dress warmly, how to deal with snow and ice and things like that, how to prep your bike and keep it maintained. We'll probably start offering those in October. Our in-person on-bike classes, those are suspended indefinitely until the coronavirus pandemic diminishes significantly, which it is not. Other questions?
Hi, this is Katie. Sorry, I'm monopolizing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You talked about, every 7 to 10 rides or so, degreasing and cleaning the chain. And then it sounded like most of the other tasks were once a year or so. Is there anything else that you do in between more frequently?
Those are the lubing the chain and pumping up the tires are your most frequent maintenance jobs. The adjusting barrel, like, lubing the cables and stuff like that, that's like once a year. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Getting old. The adjusting barrels, that's kind of an as needed type job. As your brake pads wear in for the brakes, or with new bikes and new cables as needed to make them work correctly as they stretch out. When I have a brake cable that's been kind of broken in and it's not stretching out anymore, I can go a couple of years without messing with those, at least the gear adjusting barrels, because it's dialed in and it's working correctly. You want to do like a bike safety inspection, and we have a video called an ABC Quick Check on our website. You want to do that every time you ride. Just check over your bike. You never know when something's coming loose. You want to check wear and tear. Give you an example. I went on a bike tour. It was like a 2-week self-supported tour with me and my girlfriend on my touring bike. And I mean, I keep an eye on my bike, and I thought the tires were in decent shape and ready to go. And they did just fine during the first half of that 2-week bike tour. But during the second half, we hit rougher trail, and I got 12 flat tires in the course of 3 days. And one of the tires ended up getting damaged, and it was just, they were old. They didn't look old, but they were old. Same thing happened to my girlfriend on a different bike tour where the tires were so old. Again, they didn't look all that worn out, but the tread literally came off the tire. And I was like, oh gosh, you're going to be lucky to get to a bike shop the next day with it in that condition. And we did some stuff we ended up rotating her tires so that the one that was less worn out was on the back, where that's the tire that works harder. And she was able to get to the shop and get both tires changed. But keep an eye on your tires. Some tires are now coming with what are called wear marks. Like I use Continental Gator Skins, which is a road tire. It has a little hole in the tread, and the hole is actually a wear mark. And when that hole disappears, you've worn off enough tread that it's time to replace that tire. I find that those tires are super durable, and the sidewall ends up drying out before the wear mark disappears. And also just, keep an eye on your brake pads. They do wear out and disappear. Most brake pads have some kind of a mark on them, or their own kind of like tread or pattern. When that tread or pattern disappears from the brake pad, or you have only 1/8 of an inch of material left, it's time for a new brake pad. Disc brake pads are different because they're already pretty thin to begin with, and you should read your manufacturer's specifications. But I think my manufacturer on one of my brake pad disc brakes says if it's less than 2 millimeters or something like that, you have to replace the pads. So Rob asks, what maintenance and for how long should we expect and ask for a bike shop to provide inclusive of the bike purchase price? So that depends on the shop and their policies. I know a bike shop in New York City that provides lifetime maintenance as long as you purchase the bike there. I think when I was working at Metro, and this used to be a Metro store, they provided 3 years worth of free, what they call adjustments. So if you get a flat tire, they're going to charge you for that. Or if you wear out your brake pads, they're going to charge you for that. But if you need your chain lubed, if you need, those barrel adjusters tweaked, if you need the seat raised up or down a little bit, they'll do that stuff for free. Quick little tweaks like that. Pump up your tires. Yeah, now if you go there on Sunday in May or Saturday in May, the busiest time of year, you may have to wait because the shops can get incredibly crowded for that. But when you purchase a new bike from a shop, ask them what kinds of free service they give on their bikes that are purchased at that shop, and they'll let you know. Okay, it is now 7:30. Last call for questions or comments before we wrap up our class.
Hi, I have one question. This is Ask McClure. I have a very squeaky disc brake, and I thought that changing the brake pad would fix it, but it's still very squeaky. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, by cleaning the disc rotor with a clean, fresh rag, like it's not been used to clean your chain or anything like that, and put some what's called denatured alcohol, please don't drink that, on your rag. And I believe you can also use lacquer thinner and clean the rotor and see if that helps. That should solve the problem. I will say I have a friend who purchased a bike with mechanical disc brakes, which means they use a regular brake cable. And her disc brakes were squealing. And she's a shorter, much lighter person than I am. And I rode her bike and I could not get the brakes to squeal. She'd get on the bike, right after I did, and the brakes would squeal like crazy, which I think had something to do with the weight difference and the physics or something, which was really weird. And nobody, I asked her the other day, were you able to sort that out? She's changed brake pads and things like that. It's probably some sort of a design flaw with that particular brake. But most of the time, either changing the pads or cleaning the rotor with denatured alcohol or lacquer thinner will solve the problem. Also, make sure that your pads are compatible with the rotor that you're using. I know Shimano brakes, at least when I read the descriptions, they want to be used with a certain type of pad. Bike shops should know that, like the tech should be trained to know which kind of pads go with which type of brake, by the way. I just want to add one more thing in response to that question. What I showed you this evening with adjusting the brakes applies to cable pull brakes only. There are a lot of hydraulic brakes out there which use hydraulic oil or mineral oil in a brake line, and those are totally different types of brakes. There's no adjusting barrel, there's no cable. With that, if you are not a professional mechanic, have a bike shop professionally service hydraulic disc brakes.
Thank you.
Okay, last call again for questions. All right, everybody. Well, hope you learned something tonight, and good luck keeping your own bikes maintained. I'm going to say good night. And I also want to thank our hosts at the Trek Bike Store, Tatiana and her staff, for hosting the class here tonight. Have a good evening and safe riding, everyone. Have fun with your biking.
Thank you.
Take care.